Welcome to Backyard OASIS, a podcast designed by and for older adults living in the beautiful Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts and produced in the tech studios at Greenfield Community College in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Backyard OASIS reaches out to older adults who seek knowledge to help them live more thoughtfully, healthily, and happily, who hope to inspire others with their ideas, and who serve their communities in the interest of the greater good. We hope you join us frequently in our pleasant Backyard OASIS for wide-ranging conversations with a diversity of people who are growing older and want to talk about it.
Hello, this is Christine Copeland with Backyard OASIS. Today I have the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. Ralph Baker. Dr. Baker is a soil scientist, a graduate of UMass Amherst, and he has had a notable career designing and carrying out hazardous waste cleanup projects throughout the world. In one of our earlier conversations, he explained how his company's technology had extracted Agent Orange from soil in a contaminated site in Vietnam. Today, however, we are here to discuss the soils of New England, in particular the soils of the northeastern forest. Dr. Baker retired in 2015 and has since been deeply involved with environmental organizations, which you can read about in the podcast description. My co-host today is Dr. Copeland, my husband, who served as a pediatrician in this community for 25 years. Bill and I have had students from GCC studying the forest out on our land, and he and Ralph share a number of interests. In this interview, Dr. Baker and Dr. Copeland will be Ralph and Bill for the ease of conversation. I met Ralph online with it was a
Wildlands campaign subcommittee, I think, formed out of the Climate Action Now of Western Mass and Sierra Club of Massachusetts, and maybe a couple of other groups too.
And the thing that really caught my attention was your very ingenious and sort of novel way of conserving land in Fitchburg. And that's when I asked you if you would come and allow me to interview you. So before we started on that project, it's a very interesting group, people who were very concerned about the conservation of forests in New England. And you have quite a background. I wanted to ask you when did this interest in the forests begin, and when did this interest in the wild forests, or the forever wild, or the old forests begin for you?
I would say I grew up at an early age loving trees, but since I grew up in suburbia in Swampscott, near the ocean, there weren't many forests, but there were little pocket forests, and I loved playing in them. When I went to summer camp was probably the first time up in New Hampshire that I started to experience real forests and wilderness on mountain climbing trips, and I loved that. Later on, I would say when I went to college in upstate New York, I started roaming everywhere and realizing the countryside is really where I belong, not in suburbia. So ever since I've lived in the country, and I became very comfortable visiting and exploring forests everywhere that I went. So I've had the privilege of really seeing them in many places in the world, all over the U.S. But when did I really start to appreciate the need for conserving them and protecting them? I think that came along gradually over many years, particularly when we started, owning land and having the need to steward the land. And for me, I think for many, many years, nature is a community that we belong to. It's not a commodity to exploit. I've always felt that way. And it wasn't, therefore, that much of a stretch around the time that I retired to begin to look into how I could return to my roots in land and water conservation and what I could do to help mitigate climate change, which I had become aware of actually a long time before that as such a serious risk to all of us, and biodiversity loss too. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin, in my view. And I was fortunate to meet some folks. One had been a former colleague at a hazardous waste company, Ellen Moyer, who lives out in Montgomery, so not too far from here, and had become really interested in this whole sphere of forest protection, with another person, Michael Kellett, of Restore the North Woods. I know Michael. I'm glad you do. He's so knowledgeable and really, I would say, eloquent and persuasive, real student of what's being written, and he would circulate articles to me. I've probably read hundreds of articles and papers that he's provided on all different aspects of the topic. And being a scientist, that's sort of my approach to most things, is to try to really delve into them and understand them better. And of course, he and some other people that you probably know, like Bill Stubblefield and Bart Parisius, Glenn Ayers, Janet Sinclair, a whole host of folks that are out here are really schooled in the nuances and able to articulate well, I think, what some of the arguments are for doing this work in opposition to sort of conventional wisdom that is so prevalent out there, that forests are something, at least in large part, to be exploited.
Yeah. So we share a common interest there and initiative in conserving a parcel of forested land. Bill and I bought a degraded woodlot which had been harvested perhaps 15 or 20 years prior, and are hoping to bring that back to health, resilience, diversity, and keep it there. So we did this with the help of a land trust, and they hold a conservation easement on that property. And this is the way most people concerned about conservation of their private property do it. Your project was pretty different. So can you walk us through what you did in Fitchburg?
Certainly. We've lived in Fitchburg for 20 years, and we have an old farmhouse on 7 acres that was part of a much larger parcel that got sold off to the city of Fitchburg for water supply, watershed protection land back in I think it was the 70s. So right behind us was all this watershed land that the city of Fitchburg owned. At that time, it was around maybe 1,500 acres, and you wouldn't think the city of Fitchburg would have that much land, but they actually own about 4,500 acres of watershed protection land.
And which watershed? It's the Nashua River.
It's all in the Nashua River Watershed. And so we were only there a couple of years. I'm talking about 20 years ago, when we started to notice in this beautiful woods behind us that we were enjoying walking around in all the time, that somebody had painted a lot of the trees and not painted a lot of other trees. And we started to ask about it and found out that the Division of Water Supply for the city was planning timber harvest in there, which was typical practice for them around their acreages, usually in blocks. And this was about 200-acre block that they were planning to harvest. So I asked if I could visit it with the Deputy Commissioner of Water and their forester. And they agreed, and I took a walk with them. And having studied forestry a little bit when I was at Cornell as an undergraduate, I know the lingo. I've spent enough time in forest with other people that are of a more conventional viewpoint to know where they're coming from. The rationale that they gave for the need for this harvest reduced itself pretty quickly in my mind to being primarily an economic desire, to
extract,
to create some revenue for the city, as they had in other places that I had already visited. So I knew what it looked like. They were typically removing at least 50% of the biomass within a block. And so some of that was harvestable timber, and some of it was just
in the way.
Get it out of the way so that we can promote those species that we think have more value.
Yeah.
All the while being mindful also of the need to honor their other primary interests, which were, protect the water supply, we're talking about drinking water supply for the city, as well as being careful to keep in mind the needs of wildlife and, to a certain degree, outdoor recreation. So that those were their primary interests. But nowhere did I hear anything about carbon sequestration and storage or climate concerns. We're talking about 2014, so it's not really that difficult to recognize that these folks weren't thinking along those lines, even though I already had been for a while. So I thought about it with my wife, and we wondered, what could we possibly do to prevent this harvest from going on, which I felt was a real poor choice for this particular parcel for several reasons. It was the highest elevation of any of the areas of forest that were under their stewardship. It was very biodiverse, and as far as I was concerned, it was not even age. It was not a monoculture at all. It was very, very diverse in terms of species, and it included some really valuable assets from an ecological and hydrological standpoint, including the largest wooded swamp in any of their holdings. I was concerned about the cutting plan, which the Deputy Commissioner of Water was willing to share with me, which was crossing a lot of stone walls, basically busting through the stone walls in order to get from one area to the next, because like many places in New England, this had been sheep pasture when the walls were built in the early 1800s. Then later, the forest grew up. I was also concerned about the impact that the heavy equipment would have on the soil, and we can talk about that later. But it dawned on me, okay, how about if I offered them more money as a donation, a charitable donation, than they would hope to have received through 2 cutting cycles. They said probably every 10 or 20 years they would do one of these harvests. And so I came up with this idea. I basically conveyed it in a meeting with the Water and Wastewater Enterprise Fund people, Enterprise Commission, and the chair said, and the mayor was there at the meeting too, the chair said, well, this is kind of a NIMBY thing since this is behind where you live, but I like it because you're willing to put your money where your mouth is, and most people aren't. And they liked the idea of having some money now instead of possibly some money later, because a lot of the revenue that they would receive would be reduced substantially by the cost of the forester and the loggers, what they would take as their portion. And they weren't going to get much from this 200 acres. It was going to be about $20,000 each cut.
Yeah.
And so I offered them $50,000, which in retrospect I think was a bargain.
And then that was the deal from henceforth was that this land would then be off limits to harvesting, but would still be in the town's.
Oh yes, the ownership wouldn't change. It's city land, and actually it was already subject to a conservation restriction that was conveyed by the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife of the state, so that it would never be developed. So it was already protected from being developed. But I wanted it protected from being logged, and they would only agree to do that for 30 years.
Yeah.
But I did manage to get them to agree to allow it to be potentially renewable under similar terms. So that's written, there's a memorandum of understanding that we came up with. Actually, Janet Morrison, my conservation attorney, deserves a lot of credit for helping me as sort of the architect of this memorandum of understanding, which I could show it to you. I have it with me. It's pretty long, and it conveys the intent very carefully. There's some provisions for dispute resolution if the city went in a direction that I, as the donor, wouldn't agree with. We have an ability to work it out.
Just foreseeing the unforeseen.
Yeah, because, okay, let's say, I don't know, there's a tremendous whatever you'd call it, intrusion of invasives.
Yeah.
What could we do? Or if there were, I don't know, a major hurricane like the 1938 one that knocked down a whole lot of trees, would we do anything about it or not? So those kinds of things are built into it. It's still public land, and the city council, after we went through with this and conveyed the donation and the MOU was recorded in the registry, they decided to vote unanimously to name this forest reserve the Baker Family Public Forest Reserve.
Nice.
Cool.
And we put up some signs, and I can show you one, not that the people listening can see it, but
can people visit
yes,
and hike in your?
Yes, they can.
Uh-huh.
So we have these signs that my wife kind of designed, and it has the city's website on it and city seal. It says City of Fitchburg Public Water Supply, Baker Family Public Forest Reserve.
So
205 acres.
Can we visit that swamp, that wetland that you mentioned?
Are there trails?
Yes.
Oh, great.
There are some trails, and in fact,
we can put some of that information at the end of the podcast, and so people might be interested in some of the people that you mentioned, and and also information about the public forest
be happy
reserve.
to provide resources for people to look at.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to be leading a public hike on Saturday through this forest reserve.
Okay, maybe we could put that out in the
Yeah.
Well, it's probably going to
after this.
Yeah, it's probably not going to be possible for people to sign up, but I would do it again, or I'd take you out.
Yeah. So I'm going to hand this over to Bill, but I'm going to hand it over with a little bit of an intro. You talked about forest sequestration. I'm really interested. Most people, when they think about the forest, at least my friends, think about the forest above ground. You know, the beautiful trees. You talked about the diversity of flora and fauna. Bill did a little bit of work with a soil scientist from UMass and a student from here, from GCC, Community College, regarding the soil. And so I want you guys to talk about the importance of soil, because whoever talks about that these days when they're talking about the forest?
I love talking about soil.
I bet you do.
But not that many people ask me about it anymore, so go ahead.
Well, I came into this really from a kind of just a personal appreciation for the land that we had bought and had, because our home is now situated on the edge of some land that we put together from multiple parcels and put a conservation restriction on it. But over time, and I was relatively new to New England because I lived in the South when it came up here, in the late 80s. And then started to learn really more about the forest really in the 2000s, specifically New England, how much glacial soils and rocks everywhere. You put them in the stone wall and you think, oh, that's all the rocks there are. No, there's so many more rocks.
Absolutely.
Down underneath. So you start digging. But the thing that I was also interested in kind of cycling, element cycling and systems. You know, when you think about carbon, you know, there's a carbon cycle that involves the atmosphere and the ocean and the water and the soil and the trees, all of that. But some of these nutrients that the trees absolutely have to have, are minerals, and they do not have cycles that involve that are renewing the resource on a short-term scale, like calcium in particular, you know, is leached from soil into water, goes to the ocean. Well, it gets back up into high land over millions of years. You basically have, you know, movement of continental land masses, but really it's a one-way flow. It goes away, and then it's restored just by weathering. So I was interested in kind of like how quickly is the weathering of the bedrock under these forest soils releasing the nutrients that go into the wood of the trees, go out in the water, but also have an accelerated removal when trees are harvested, when any living biomass is harvested, but also especially after 50 years of acid rain, which had mobilized more of these cations, these nutrients, and so were we facing nutrient shortages?
Well, that's a very astute set of observations that you've just described. It's a complex topic. For one thing, all of our soils aren't the same at all. And those glacial till soils that you've just described are very common in our uplands, but not in the valleys or along rivers. So just ought to emphasize that to begin with. When trees are harvested repeatedly, I would say, yes, you're gradually degrading the reservoir of nutrients. Nonetheless, there are different processes going on in the soil, and you can see that, let's say, just by looking at mosses and other kinds of organisms that are able to actually extract nutrients from rock. Well, what is soil? Soil is a combination of a lot of particles of inorganic soil that comes from rock. Whatever it either came from the rock down below where this site is, or the glacier brought it in from someplace, let's say 20 or 30 miles up gradient, and deposited it there. But either way, there's a lot of inorganic soil particles that are gradually releasing their nutrients. Turns out, we're learning this recently. I didn't know this up until about 10 or 15 years ago, that there's a lot of different microorganisms, primarily bacteria and fungi, that work on these particles and help to bring their nutrients into their bodies. And trees are able to induce the movement of bacteria in particular, and fungi too, into their root tips. And the bacteria enter into the tree roots. The trees extract the nutrients from the bacteria. They actually strip the membranes off the outside of the bacteria, collect the nutrients, and then release the bacteria back outside into the soil, where a lot of them can regenerate themselves. This is called rhizophagy. And a professor at Rutgers James White has a whole big lab with many postdocs and grad students that have been studying this for the last, I would say, 20 years. And it's just amazing stuff. We didn't know that plants and their collection of microorganisms working together are so symbiotic that they can extract their own nutrients from the soil. And actually, from an agricultural standpoint, adding commercial fertilizers inhibits that process.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah, Tony mentioned that. So Tony's the soil guy here.
Okay. So this is so stunning and relatively new that a lot of people don't recognize it. But that's what regenerative agriculture is all about. And that draws a lot of its, I guess, inspiration from what is happening naturally in intact places like forests. Then there's the organic matter. We haven't talked about that at all. A tremendous number of the, I would say, beneficial qualities that are in more intact forests and that are lessened in a degraded forest are due to the organic matter. What is that? That's the breakdown products of vegetation that falls on the forest floor and rots.
Humus.
And turns into humus.
Yeah.
Very complex organic molecules. They can have molecular weights of up in the thousands, if that means anything to the audience. So they're big molecules of humic and fulvic acids, and they impart a lot of the most desirable qualities to the soil when it comes to plant growth. They retain nutrients. They also retain water. And in a really high quality site, such as in the forest out behind us in places, the organic layer can be 6 inches thick and really spongy and beautiful, easy to dig through with your fingers. And so that's so valuable. But when you go and start logging, especially with heavy equipment, a lot of that gets degraded. It's not that it couldn't come back in time, but it might take a long time. In human, in a human scale, it's too long.
Well, we see this. We definitely see it.
In our forests, what I've noticed, you were talking about moss, is, and I wanted to ask you about this, does this change sort of the hydrology of the land? Because the streams seem to be becoming more defined. The edges of the stream have more moss along them. It just feels like it's darkening,
There's a group actually meeting today out of UMass Amherst, which I sometimes participate in, out of the Massachusetts Ecosystem Climate Adaptation Network, called Slow the Flow. And it's all about trying to take measures to slow the flow of water that falls by precipitation onto the land and then ends up eventually in our rivers and in the ocean. By slowing the flow, you can mitigate the worst floods and also the worst droughts, both at the same time. Natural forests do this. Disturbed forests do not. They result in more rapid runoff, which is really detrimental. It's detrimental to the aquatic conditions in the rivers and streams. And it's detrimental to people because flooding can be so damaging. We had in Leominster, right next door to where I live, in September of 23, was horrible flooding. It wiped out the commuter rail tracks in one place and homes and businesses. So this is something that we really have to start to think about protecting ourselves against, because this kind of flooding is going to become more and more frequent, as are the flash droughts that occur when you go through a long period during the growing season when there isn't much rain. So I guess we're getting a little sideways to the topic, but these are the reasons that It's so important to allow forests to sequester and store carbon in the soil. 50% of the carbon that's in a typical northeastern forest is in the soil. And I'm not talking about the roots. I'm talking about the soil. The rest of it's in the roots and the above ground biomass. And so by harvesting and also compacting the soil under heavy equipment and rutting it up and scarifying it, all those things are denigrating those qualities, and to our loss, and to the loss of all the other fellow creatures that are depending upon these places. Yeah. So that's why, for me, protecting some of our forests in as natural a condition as possible and not allowing nature to be self-willed, letting nature take its course, so to speak, is very important. Now, we're not going to do that with all of our forests, clearly. For one thing, 80% of them are owned by private properties, and for some people, they need the forest. They need to be able to harvest some of the forest because that's their nest egg. Yeah. That may be what they're depending on for retirement. Yeah. Plus, we love wood. I do.
Yeah.
So that's an important resource. But right now, unfortunately, in our state and throughout the Northeast, the vast majority of our forest land is working forest. That's the term for forest that is being commercially cut from time to time, just as the city of Fitchburg's forest was, except for this one forest reserve. It's the only forest reserve in the 4,500 acres that the city of Fitchburg has. It's only 200 acres. We want to increase that tremendously if we can.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question about that, because when you hear the arguments, it seems like it's, one side of the argument is preserve the forest forever wild, and New England is just going to become a big national forest. And then the other side of the argument is, we need to cut our own wood rather than getting wood from, other parts of the globe. But really, it's not two equal sides. We're talking about percentages, right? I mean, the people who are advocating for forever wild are talking about a slightly larger percentage, which right now is what?
3.
It's about 3%, maybe generously 3%, perhaps less.
Yeah.
We want to get it up to at least 10% and maybe 20%.
Yeah,
and in fact, the Commonwealth has that as a goal right now, to do that. And to the point that you just made, which I think is one that I hear a lot, and we all hear a lot, there's plenty of evidence that a lot of the forest that's getting harvested in New England, the wood is going up to Canada, and it's being exported to other places. So it's not being used here. Some of it is, or some of it comes back from Canada because the biggest mills are there, and so the 2x4s or the particle board or whatever it is that we all use in our houses and so forth. A lot of that is not coming from here, but a lot of what is here and is being cut is not staying here. So these arguments are a bit fallacious in my view. And I think unfortunately, a lot of the forest industry is sort of captured by their need to profit off of extracting these resources. A lot of loggers, especially over the past 20 years, and I would say, have gotten into deep debt with very expensive large equipment, which is very efficient and can make them a lot of profit if they can keep it busy. But unfortunately, that's to the detriment of a lot of those qualities that I was talking about, those ecosystem services, because they have to go out and log in times of year that never before would they have done that. Used to be when I actually spent a winter logging on an organic farm up in Maine when I was young with horses. And a lot of the time, the ground was covered with snow or it was frozen. Yeah, and that's when the logging would occur. But now it's not necessary. I mean, this past winter, we had a significant period when it was cold and frozen. But most winters, that's not happening anymore. So the damage being done to our soils in the forest,
soft, thawed or thawing.
It's much more susceptible to being rutted, to being compacted on the heavy equipment. Once it's compacted, it's not going to become uncompacted and loose and permeable again for a long time.
We've seen all that on our property, all the compaction, the ruts, the butt scars.
We could still see those roads.
Yeah.
But Bill, why don't you talk a little bit about what you found to be, I don't know whether this is the case everywhere, but in terms of, flora moving through the landscape with climate change and the risk of invasives and stuff. What did you find down below regarding invasives and their incursion into an older forest?
Yeah, they did I think you know where this is going, because we did an inventory when the conservation restriction was developed, and there were in hotspots of invasive plants at the log landings, the places where the machines had come, compacted the soil, and left openings. And so we have, every invasive species that you can name in those places. But in between, where the canopy has recovered, and this has been, the last logging was 1994, there were some escapes, essentially, of the invasives that might be translocated by birds, barberry, Japanese barberry, and some Asian bittersweet. Both have attractive, colorful berries that birds can move around. But basically, those two species only are the ones that I see now in openings. But where the canopy is closed, no, we do not see them.
That's right.
And they're not making inroads.
They thrive in places where there's been disturbance. And because of the nature of logging, starting with those landings and then the logging roads, tend to be conduits for invasives to come in. Mm-hmm. And also ATVs in a lot of places. Yeah. So let's step back. You're absolutely right. These things could have been prevented through, I would say, strict adherence to best management practices, as it's called, BMPs, which would require that the equipment be washed before it comes into the landing. And I mean, at construction sites, it's pretty common to do this sort of thing, but I seldom ever see it in logging operations. And although the state, the service foresters are supposed to be overseeing these cuts according to the Forest Practices Act, it's a very loose, loose adherence. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of careless work, and you can even see where the machinery has bumped into trees and scarred them, or taken out an excess number of trees compared to what was actually in the logging plan. Just because they're so big, they have to be able to get through and do their work. So it's unfortunate that invasives are coming in to places that never saw them before. But if you keep a reasonable amount of intact forest, and let's say had limited your cuts with smaller equipment to smaller areas, let's say 5 acres or something like that, the invasives might not actually even come in at all. So there are, I think, tools whereby careful harvesting could be done without those kinds of, as much of the negative impacts, especially compaction, erosion, and sedimentation would be far less. There used to be a lot of people that would log with, let's say, a farm tractor or horses, both of which are really low impact compared to the modern equipment. I would say I'm really down on the large equipment, even though it's very efficient, and some of our listeners may actually own some. I would say it's unfortunate that things have gone in this direction. It's not helping our landscape. Yes, large equipment, gosh, we see it in construction sites all the time, and home sites, big excavators, actually to the detriment of the quality of the soil that's left for the homeowners. I've seen this too. And by and large, the landscapers and the excavator operators don't even realize what they're doing to the soil. Nobody's taught them to be careful. So I think that these are
the
things.
homeowners-
There are opportunities to educate
Mm-hmm.
people, and I'm not sure, how exactly to reach out and get to them. And regulations are another way to address this kind of a problem, but only if they're enforced.
Well, this type of thing, this conversation, I think, is one way to. I was unaware of what could happen to soil when we built our house. I had to be educated about the effects of large equipment compacting the soil. I didn't know what that would do, what that would mean for our plantings and such. So we could certainly go on for a long time, but
Yes.
but we are running out of time. This has been an amazing conversation and a very important one, and I think this is exactly how things will change. It's just to continue to have these conversations about things that aren't necessarily oppositional, but that just bring a different perspective.
I think the change is driven by people's values that they may have had all along, but now we realize that we're up against some changes that we really don't want.
Mm-hmm.
And if we were going to really uphold our values in this time of change, we have to do things that we might not have ever thought we had to do.
That's right. And it's one of my goals right now, at this stage in my life, to try to engage more and more people in appreciating what we're losing, what we need to do to prevent losing a lot more, and basically, save ourselves. As a species, we depend on nature being healthy around us, and to the extent that we gradually take over nature everywhere. And bear in mind, between human beings and our domesticated animals, they now account for about 90% of all of the animals on Earth.
Yeah.
Wow, that's domination. We've already dominated so many places. We need to say, okay, we've got to set aside some places so nature can continue to be healthy for ourselves and for our fellow creatures. Let's do that. It's important.
And for our children.
Yes, of course.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. Thank you, Bill, for participating in this. And as we said at the beginning, if people would like more information about the topic or also about the Baker Family Public Forest Reserve, we'll have that. It'll be at the bottom of the podcast. Thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This concludes today's podcast. We're always looking for new ideas, so feel free to reach out to Judy Raper, Associate Dean of Community Engagement at Greenfield Community College, at 413-775-1819 if you have an idea you'd love to share. Special thanks to the creators of Backyard OASIS, Denise Schwartz, Chad Fuller, Dennis Lee, and Christine Copeland. Have a great day.